Good afternoon. I think we're live. Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. I'm Ruth, and we are live on a little bit later than usual on a Thursday with a usual Facebook Live. I have a very special guest who I'm going to bring in just a moment. So let me know if you are listening on Facebook or YouTube, or where are we live? We're on LinkedIn. And if you have any questions for me or our special guest, we're talking about the IB diploma. So let's meet Jerome. Good afternoon, evening. How are you doing, Jerome?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Good, thanks. So we have known each other for a little while, and for those who are watching, would you just like to introduce yourself briefly?
Absolutely. So my name is Jerome Barty Taylor. I'm based here in Hong Kong. I run Barty Education and Development, which is a sort of tutoring and education consultancy firm. We do a lot of work with students who are thinking about doing the IB diploma, who are in the IB diploma, and thinking about where to go for university, advising on college admissions in the US, and also looking at other applications in the UK and globally. I myself did the IB a long time ago, so I like to think that I like to think that I have an understanding of the IB diploma and what the advantages that it brings, and that's something that I try to impart into all of our students if they choose to go down that path.
Right. So for those of you who are listening, and a lot of people watch this after the fact, it's not the best time. I know that especially if you've got small children, but it's amazing, like how many, like we in our daily lives, Jerome, that we meet parents of very, very young children who are already thinking about the IB diploma, and what are they doing? They're already checking the results. So we'll get to that in the moment. So I think that this is a really interesting chat for parents of children of all ages, as long as they haven't already finished the IB diploma. Would you say agree with that? So let's get into it. If you have any questions for Jerome about the IB diploma, just type your questions below, and he will be very happy to answer them. So shall we start with just in a nutshell, what is it, for those that don't know?
So the IB diploma, and the term gets bandied around a lot, I think, especially when we're talking about, which school should I choose? Is the IB system the right one for my child? But when we talk about IB diploma, we're just talking about the final 2 years. So that's grade 11 and 12. Or if you go to a school that follows years, and that's year 12 or year 13. And it's the oldest part of sort of schooling that the International Baccalaureate Organization runs. They've been running the IB diploma since the late 1960s. So it has a very strong institutional memory to the curriculum. The examiners very much know what they want, the skills they want the IB diploma, successful IB diploma candidate to display. And so it's a rigorous program in which students do 6 subjects. It doesn't prioritize perhaps specialization in a particular area, which we might see in more traditionally in A-levels in the UK system. Instead, it follows much more the European model of wanting high school leavers to be able to show breadth as well as depth, and to show that they've studied a number of different complementary areas.
Yeah, I think that's a good start. I think, parents do get confused. And I think that the confusing thing about Hong Kong, of course, is that we have schools that mix and match. So I've got a panel discussion next week with focused on more, well, actually, it's not focused on primary at all, but it's discussing IB or the UK curriculum or Montessori or something else. And so, of course, we've got a number of schools in Hong Kong that use the IB diploma for the last 2 years, but then their children haven't been doing it up to that point. What's your view on that, Jerome?
I mean, I think that for families who are perhaps in a school that's not doing the IB diploma, or they're thinking perhaps, well, my child's in a different system, should I put them into the IB diploma? I think it's worth remembering that the middle years program and the primary years program are much more recent additions to the IB stable, and so it's really only in the last 15 years that we've seen the creation and or widespread adoption of PYP and MYP. And so for most of the IB's history, most of the IB diploma's history, students would be going into it after doing something completely different in years immediately preceding. And that's not necessarily a disadvantage. In some cases, it might be an advantage, and that's something we can talk about perhaps later, because I'm sure if we do have some questions, that'll be something that's on people's minds. But I think that I think that the sort of critical thinking skills and the global awareness that the IB diploma really values in its students can sit as a sort of self-contained element of the curriculum. And it's something which good IB schools want to make sure that all of their diploma students have some understanding of. And so that's part of their teaching.
I don't know about you, but I do feel that in the local sector, particularly where some of the schools are picking up the diploma, they're not necessarily embracing the entire spirit of the intention of as you say, the critical thinking, the globalization, behind it. I don't know if you would agree with that. Do you have students from local schools doing IB?
Yeah, we absolutely do. I mean, I think it depends very much on the school. Obviously, some of Hong Kong's local private schools doing the IB diploma produce top scorers, and it's been my getting 45, and it's been my great joy to teach some of them, because obviously when you're working with an 18-year-old who's that committed and really wants to hit the marks, that's that's sort of really a great fun, from a teaching perspective. I think that perhaps by nature of those schools being as academically competitive as they are, they're perhaps choosing only a subset of the final 2 years to be going into that.
Yeah.
I think, that also leads into another question about whether the IB diploma is right for all students, and those schools are making a judgment whether or not for the right reasons as to which students should be doing the IB diploma or perhaps would be best suited to doing the DSE. But that becomes the question about, does the IB diploma suit everybody?
Right.
But to go back to your earlier point about the spirit of the IB diploma, I think it's not perhaps a function of the school and whether it's a local or an international school per se, but how committed the senior leadership team are to the IB diploma. If the IB coordinator is themselves someone who did the IB diploma, I think that inevitably when any curriculum becomes more popular and is adopted by a wider number of schools, as of course we know the IBDP has in Hong Kong in recent years, there's perhaps a little bit of slippage in terms of making sure that all the children have the same appreciation of sort of IBDP values in the learner profile perhaps than might have been the case in the past.
Interesting. Yeah, well, so we're focusing on we'll leave local schools aside, because obviously what I do, I focus obviously on private schools and mostly international schools. And as you said, IB diploma is the most prevalent graduating diploma amongst all of the schools. So what should they consider when they're considering whether or not it is a fit? Because, just for a moment, being, my own personal experience, I think I shared this with you the other day. My children, one of them had a choice, and I just knew that it wasn't the right fit for one of them, and they're both doing A-levels actually, but they did IB all the way. They did PYP and MYP up until quite later on, but we get this question all the time: how should my child continue and do the IBDP? Quoting what you said at the start, it's rigorous.
Yeah, so I think I think there's a few ways to look at this, but I would normally say to the parent, well, I would say to all parents that we can't really make the decision about the IB diploma until the child is a teenager, until once
At
we
least
know,
13, right?
yeah, 13, if not 14 or 15, because it's that's
Agree.
such a crucial point of development. And
Yep.
also with the last few years, with so many so much disruption to education and schools really trying their best with a protracted period of online learning, but it has impacted all students at all ages in different ways. And so that's why we saw, for example, in the IB diploma results that came out last year, lots of students didn't score as highly as they thought they did because the IBO decided to sort of, well, go back to their 2019 grading curve and say, well, no, this is, these are the mark boundaries. This is what we expect you to be able to achieve. So, putting, I suppose, disruption to learning aside, I think by the time a student reaches 14 or 15, certainly by 16, we have an idea of certainly what subjects they enjoy, perhaps more importantly, what subjects they don't enjoy.
Yeah.
And if your child is at a school where they're going to be funneled into a particular second language, for example, because that's a second language which is available at the school, and there isn't really resource for doing another language course from ab initio, because I should clarify, in the IBDP, it's absolutely mandatory that students do one foreign language. And so traditionally, one did that foreign language at basically intermediate level, assuming you'd already had some high school instruction in it. So, that would be Chinese SL or HL, but B. Then the IB introduced ab initio languages, where basically you take a beginner's language for 2 years and you're expected to reach intermediate level in those 2 years, assuming you have had no instruction in it. Now, if you have a child who absolutely hates the second language they've been doing, in their school up until now, and they don't want to carry it forward into the final 2 years, and that's going to be a hardship for them and a battle potentially with parents, and some people do find learning languages more difficult, then that might be a reason why the IB was, less suitable for that child.
But Hong Kong's a bit different, isn't it? Because it's quite ironic, like when you say they're supposed to do a foreign language. I mean, almost all of our children in Hong Kong take Chinese as their language B, and it's hardly a foreign language. But there is the requirement for them to do a language aside from English, usually.
Yeah, and certainly some schools, as we know, require students who've been in a higher stream of Chinese through secondary to then do Chinese A as their language. Right. And
we should break down some of the terminology, Jerome, because I'm aware that So let's do some jargon busting, shall we?
Absolutely.
So we've got language A and language B. We've got higher level, standard level, and ab initio. And what else? And we've got 6 courses plus TKO and EE. And each course has 7 marks, and then the total is 45 marks. What did I miss out?
So 6 7s are 42, and then we've got our 3 core points, which is the TOK and the extended essay.
Yeah. And higher level, you have to do 3 subjects at higher level, 3 subjects at standard level, and all components are mandatory, including the language that you've just been describing.
Well, exactly. And, I think sometimes, in terms of whether the IB diploma is right, for my child, the question then becomes, is the subject combination that my child can do at that school with the combination of subjects that they feel comfortable doing at higher level rather than the ones at standard level, will that be a good outcome for them? Because sometimes, and I've worked with many students over the years who go into the IB diploma not really perhaps knowing what they want to do at the end of it, but also thinking, well, I don't like I'm not very good at science. Science is not my strong point. So maybe I'll just do my science credit, and I'll do that at standard level so I can do an easier science course. And I don't really like maths. So, okay, all right, I'll do standard level maths as well. But once we're putting those 2 subjects to standard level, we're sort of we've only got 1 more standard level spot. So we're sort of then preempting and saying, okay, well, we're going to be doing English and humanities at higher level, if not a second language. And for some students, that might not suit them either. So especially once you throw in the subject combinations that are available at their school. So
Exactly.
it becomes a little bit of a balancing game, really.
There's a lot more moving parts to it than A levels, which is, you tutor students that do A levels too, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, where they're choosing in Hong Kong, I think, are they choosing 4, sometimes 3 or 4 A levels plus the EPQ, which is the extended project qualification. So it's a lot more straightforward, in a sense, isn't it, than the IB?
I mean, yeah, and I think that certainly there are, if you have, a child at 16 who really wants to do engineering, is very, very focused on maths and science, or even potentially a student who's very, very focused on wanting to study medicine, there isn't any real advantage delivered through doing the IB diploma from an admissions perspective. Of course, one can make a philosophical argument that as the IB diploma did through its very foundation, that it's important that kids in their final 2 years have breadth and learn, lots of everything. But when, the requirement for a medicine offer might be a very high score, and we're talking, 43, 44, 45, which is very hard work, it would be, a lot more manageable for that candidate just to do 3 A levels in, chemistry, maths and biology perhaps, and then, as long as they get the A stars, and do well in the BMAT or the UK CAT, a place in medical school shouldn't be, beyond the realm of possibility. And so I think it's important to weigh up, the different subjects available, what the child is interested in, what they would like to do at university, and these are all sort of factors that go into the decision-making process.
Of course. And also by the time the child is 14, 15, 16, most likely you're going to want to involve your teenager. So you certainly don't want any resistance from
and there might be reasons why a student would want to stay in their IB diploma school and not switch to A levels, even if there was an argument to be made for switching systems from an admissions perspective. We forget that, teenagers are, young adults. They have their friendships. They have, strong social bonds. I think as parents and, in our sort of role, Ruth, we're always sort of forced to think tactically, and we don't necessarily sort of think back to perhaps ourselves as teenagers and think, well, we would always, if we knew we had teacher X for English next year, we'd think, oh, great, that's a good teacher. I had them in grade 9, so I'll enjoy English next year. Do you know what I mean? And so I think that when...
I can't remember, Jerome. It's a lot more recent history for you. But I've got kids going through it now. So, but no, I totally, I hear you. I understand. Let's talk a little bit about, I think a lot of parents who are watching this do have younger children, and it might feel like it's a very, very long way away. And they might be experiencing PYP at the moment. But let's talk a little bit more about how it really ramps up, and by the time it gets to diploma, how rigorous it actually is. And I mean, how different is it from A levels, and how different is it from PYP and MYP?
So I think if we talk about assessment in diploma for a second, I think that students going into the diploma program are assessed in their subjects, whether it be standard level or higher level, really in the way in which they will be assessed on the final exam, but from the beginning of the program. And so that means that when students go into diploma, at the beginning of the first year, first term, they can sometimes feel like they're, it's all like sink or swim, and they're sort of struggling to hold onto the raft a little bit. I would say that more generally in schools that do A levels, because they're usually coming through the UK system before that, there is a sort of expectation that there's everyone always says to you, oh, there's a big step up when you move up into your A levels, and that's fine. And so the first term is about helping you make that step. And it's quite, not even in a UK school, actually, sometimes parents say to me, oh, but A-levels are so rigid. And I say, you've never been to a school that did A-levels where people are swapping in and out of classes for the first 8 weeks because they actually realize, I started off doing A-level drama and I'm not interested in drama and I should be doing A-level, French instead. And, that sort of movement is also perfectly, to be expected. But perhaps in the way in which A-levels are assessed, because there aren't exams in year one, and it's very much a 2-year linear program focusing on all those modules at the end. There's more of a sort of acceptance of a learning curve for students as they go through A-levels. I think in IB diploma, there's very much an expectation that we will start assessing students and tracking their performance against the kind of tasks that we would expect to see them do on the final exam from the beginning. So that obviously is challenging. That's a big step up for students. And I think when we think about them coming up into the diploma from the middle years program, and indeed the primary years program before that, I'm sure there are lots of parents here this evening who think, oh, this PYP, MYP doesn't seem to be like when I was in school. I don't know when my child last wrote an essay, for example. And so, why isn't my child getting feedback on their writing? What are these criteria? And so but I think that because of the nature of the MYP criteria assessment, to use that example, students are perhaps less used to writing essays to time. They are not, in science, for example, so used to sort of sitting down and having to commit a certain amount of scientific understanding to memory, because that's not something that's tested regularly in MYP assessment. And so then suddenly to go into a system where your teacher is teaching something once and then moving on, because HL science courses require 240 hours of content, and I don't know of any school that's providing 240 teaching hours over the 2 years, because there's just not enough time in school to do that. So everything's being compressed. And if a teacher's going over a particular topic at the beginning of the IB diploma, with luck, there should be a revision period built in, in the March before the final exams in May, where that's revisited, we hope. But if there isn't, then the onus is very much on the individual student to be revising that material, making flashcards, going through the textbook, revising their notes. And that is a set of practices and study skills that very much hasn't been built up in the middle years program.
No, it's not built up, is it? Why is that?
That is the age-old question. I think that the nature of, I think perhaps, how would I put it? I think in Hong Kong, and particularly in international schools, we have lots of wonderful teachers who have come from all sorts of different educational backgrounds before coming to Hong Kong. So we have teachers from perhaps, really almost, every country, and every system. And so this means that you have teachers coming in, very experienced middle years teachers, for example, or primary educators. But if they've worked in, they've trained in an original system that is perhaps less focused on standardization of curriculum. So, for example, in the American high school system, of course, there's the Common Core and the standards and the expectations, but whether a student gets an A or not is ultimately down to that individual's discretion. Obviously, I don't mean to criticize the American high school system at all. It's based on an educational philosophy that gives autonomy to the individual teacher, absolutely. But perhaps someone coming from that background into the IB system, the need to sort of scaffold and build up writing through regular essays and feedback is perhaps less, less part of their teaching pedagogy. I think also perhaps because I think especially in the last few years, there's been a lot of movement between international schools and also in and out of schools in Hong Kong. And where you have perhaps a couple of teachers leaving 1 year and then a third teacher leaves the year after, and then the head of department leaves the next year, suddenly you've got on a 3-year cycle an entirely new department. And at that point, you don't have the same institutional memory as a core group of teacher, pooling resources, thinking, how are we delivering this program in accordance with best practice? And so sometimes that means that individual subjects at certain schools can unfortunately suffer. And so I think...
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead. You think?
No, I mean, no, I believe, I'm sure that's something you can speak to in the context of your own children.
No, I was just going to say that, just in the work that we do, it's why we always say to parents that, on paper, you might have 3 or 4 or 5 IB schools that on paper kind of look similar, but there could be so many sort of such, critical differences between how they execute, how they teach, who is teaching. So it's really, so we always advise parents to really just look, we have to go beneath the surface, and one IB school in Hong Kong could be quite different from another.
Absolutely.
So let's wow, we've already been waffling on for half an hour, but if you do have any questions for Jerome, don't be shy, or any questions for me, hopefully related to the IB. We can extend questions to PYP and MYP, but we're particularly discussing the diploma program tonight. So maybe slightly controversial, but we're not afraid of being slightly controversial. In your experience, what kind of children genuinely don't do well? Or maybe you could just speak to, a couple of case studies where, with the benefit of hindsight, might not have been the best idea for that child to sit the diploma.
Yeah, I mean, I can think of, I've had various students over the years who, one boy in particular who went to an international school in Hong Kong, which I know to be an aspiration for many parents who are thinking about the IB diploma. I probably shouldn't say which, but
is it the one that requires 2 language A's?
No, it's not. Not that one actually.
Okay, it's the other one. I know it's the one that. Yeah. Okay.
But, this young fellow had been. He wasn't particularly interested in school before I got to him, and he hadn't. I think he'd been suspended every single year in grade 1 through grade 10 for one reason or another. And there were, a number of things going on at home, which meant that his behavior was not really, what we would like it to be. And obviously families are complex social organisms, and sometimes, things go wrong and that gets reflected in the kids. So, I suppose our involvement became greater because I guess we just felt, me particularly personally, I just felt sorry for this kid. It wasn't his fault that things were going on the way they were at home, but for whatever reason, he didn't particularly want to be in school. Things had not gone well for him. And suddenly he finds himself at the beginning of IB diploma, not really knowing, what he was doing, and sort of then asked a friend for help. And his friend said, oh, well, there's this Jerome guy. You better get in touch with him and see if one of his people can help you. This was, I suppose, so to give you the end of the story, he got 39 on the IB diploma, a perfectly respectable score. Yes. He applied to the UK and got into all of his options. I think he got into Edinburgh, Durham, Bristol, Manchester and St Andrews, all for international relations, because history was his best subject in school. And these are not easy universities to get into, particularly for IR. And he did the work, and then he made the offers. But for him, I guess, to go back, for him at the end of grade 10, having to go into a course where he was having to do, business and history, and frankly English, which he never particularly enjoyed. And then because of which subjects the school would let him do at higher level, he ended up being sort of stuck in higher level English because there wasn't another subject he could do at higher level because he didn't have a lot of science. And so I remember thinking, even at the time, if this kid was doing A levels and he was just focusing on, perhaps history, PRS, philosophy and religious studies, or politics and perhaps economics, that would be so much closer to his interests. And he's since been getting internships with investment banks in his, summer holidays. So he's, very much going down a track now to being very successful in business, which is great. But, knowing that boy as I did at 16, would I say that the IB diploma was the best solution for him? No, I would have said his life is being more difficult by being in a situation where he's having to constantly manage all these things. And that's perhaps a really important point, which we haven't talked about yet, which perhaps I should.
ADHD.
Well, not in his case particularly.
Okay.
I mean, perhaps, I mean, his profile is perhaps not inconsistent with some of the sort of things that display with ADHD. No, what I should say is that the IB requires incredible organization skills.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't matter whether a kid has ADHD or a learning difference or they don't. Sometimes, teenage boys are just, not very good at organizing themselves as well. They don't particularly have a diagnosis. And I think that for that boy in particular, certainly his first year was a real struggle because he was always sort of, trying to fight one fire and then the next thing was late or hadn't been done. And so I think parents should be aware when they're thinking, is IB diploma suitable? They need to be thinking, does my child have really good self-organization and management skills? And if they don't, then something I've talked about before, actually, when doing podcasts during online learning is sort of like, well, perhaps parents need to assume more of a sort of CEO role where they say, well, I'm not going to do the IB diploma for you, but, you're in charge of the IB diploma department. You've got to tell me what resources you need to make this happen. And I can help you come up with strategies to use to make that work. You've got to be the one actually doing it, but also you've got to communicate and tell me what you need. And so then the role of the parent, it's a management role, but it does mean being involved and understanding the deadlines that kid is working to, and then being able to provide support as and when they're able to meet them.
No, but it's a good point. I mean, to extrapolate that case study that you were talking about, if the child is not self-motivated or not organized, they're going to need some intervention to get through the IB.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And precisely. And I think, that's why, I think so many schools in Hong Kong have switched over to the IB diploma. And I have vast amounts of respect for it, and I love it, having done it myself. I absolutely believe in the educational value that it delivers. But at the same time, I know that it's not right for all students. And I also know that, there are, in the UK, for example, including the school that I went to when I was a teenager there, has since introduced the IB, but they've kept A levels as the other option. So kids have... a lot
of schools in the UK do both. And I know that requires a lot of resources. I think it would be nice if a couple of our schools in Hong Kong did offer both. We've only got very, very small number of schools offering A levels. So there's almost not a great deal of choice. I think
that, it would be lovely, but I think it goes back to the fact that you need to have very, very committed staff, and you need to have staff who've been in that institution for a long time, and for the department to really know what it's doing to be able to deliver those programs simultaneously. And I'm sure there are schools in Hong Kong that could do that, but I think there's almost a sort of, there's a fear of change and a sort of, well, is it worth it? And if it's not broke, don't fix it. So most, kids obviously then, including the case study I was talking about, that young chap went through IB diploma. He turned good in the end, but, I think the school certainly would have not predicted that outcome for him based on his disciplinary record in the first 10 grades. But the other thing I would say as well is that, and this is perhaps, it's pretty controversial, but kids in Hong Kong tend to start school young. This is a fact of kids going off to school and learning. What that means is that often kids will turn 17 in their final year at school. Now, not
so much anymore. Most of the schools will have
they're more cut off now.
End of August. It's only ESF really that insist on the end of December, and a few others. But yes, what
Okay.
were you going to say about that? Because I'm sure a lot of parents choose ESF. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay. I mean, let me rephrase. Oh, I work with a lot of students who are only just turning 18 at the very end of the year, when they sit there at their exams, or they're sort of going through this, they're in their final year trying to revise and understand, complex ideas in psychology or in science, or, having to write to get a 7 in English at higher level, you really need to be writing university level analysis. And, parents say to me sometimes, oh, it's great because, if my kid does well in higher level this, then he'll get credit when he goes to university next year and not have to do a first year course. Well, yes, but that means that he needs to be producing undergraduate level material.
Yes.
I think that it's worth remembering that when the IB diploma was founded, it was sort of designed, because it was originated in Europe, in Switzerland, for students to sit between the age of 17 and 19. And so the degree of intellectual maturity and sophistication that's required, especially in higher level subjects, is perhaps something which is going to be more difficult for a student who is, younger. And that's nothing to do with their intelligence. That just has to do with their age and life experience, and the fact that, when you're only 17 years old, 1 year as a percentage of your life is considerable.
What is it? You're going to work it. Yeah, it's a really good point, actually. And I often hear parents talking about sort of like losing a year, but I think of it as gaining a year. I mean, I would always rather, have I frozen? I'm back. I would always rather have a child being older, or one of my children to be slightly older in the year group. Let's talk about, actually, I do want to, maybe Suresh has a question, and then I want to come back and ask you a couple more questions. If you have anything to ask Jerome about the IB diploma, we're not going to go for too much longer, so this is kind of your last chance, then type it in the comments. Just like Suresh has asked you, or is it a question for me? Well, let's take this one together. Yeah, it's not easy. So it's a good question. Why don't you, have you got something to say on that, Jerome?
Yeah, I would say, academically, to begin with, if you're thinking about that school, Suresh, for your son or your daughter, I would absolutely want to know what subjects were available for the IB diploma first, because not all schools offer all subjects. And so, especially if you're thinking about making a change for year 12 and 13, or grade 11 and 12, then you need to understand, is the school going to be able to offer the subjects that I want my child to do? Because, I mean, all schools will say, yes, we have offered these subjects in the past, but ultimately it comes down to how many students there are in the year group. Can they form a class? Do they have enough students? Can they then, if they don't have a teacher on staff, can they hire someone to teach that class for the following year? So I think knowing the subject selection is really, really important. If you have friends who are parents at that school, I mean, I know that often something that I know Ruth has to responds to a lot on her Facebook group is, she says, please ask a more specific question. What feedback is it that you're looking for on school X? And so I think if you're wanting to get under the hood by talking to existing parents, then talking to them about individual subjects that their child has done at IB level at that school. What was the teaching like? Did they understand the teacher? What was the general feeling in the class? How big was the class? There's lots of information you can gain in terms of the students' perspectives by, if you know people who are in that school. And I think that's probably really important when you're thinking about your own child and what subjects they would do, rather than just looking at, the statistics that are published about the outcomes.
I would just add on to that while you're thinking about other things to say. Oh, my light's just turned off. Yeah, you're quite right. I mean, the range of subjects, and that's going to be very, very much dependent on the size of the cohort. And do check that out, because the size of the primary school, we have quite a number of schools which are sort of pyramid shaped. They get quite tiny at the end. And so there will definitely be fewer subjects on offer. And your point about asking parents, definitely by the time the child is like 14, 15, 16, I would circumvent the parents and just go directly to the child, because you're going to get a lot more of the truthful, the reality, at the coalface type stories. Yeah, it's a good question. What else would Suresh be?
I mean, I think I would also say things like, well, talking to the IB coordinator. So every school that does the IB diploma has an IB coordinator who is a member of staff, a senior member of staff, who's basically responsible for implementing the IB diploma in that school. And they're also accountable to the IB for running the program. And so in the day-to-day, that looks like, for example, making sure that individual subject teachers are running the internal assessments at an appropriate time within the 2 years of teaching. And so when you have an inexperienced classroom teacher, an inexperienced IB coordinator, sometimes suddenly schools will think, oh, help, they haven't done a group 4 project for science, or the English higher level language didn't do their IO at the end of the summer term of year 1, so we better schedule it for, January of year 2. Now, if you ask any more experienced IB teacher, they would, well, sorry, why didn't you schedule it for the October of year 2? Because that means the kids come back to school, the task can be produced, they have time to prep it, they do it, but they do it before the really important stuff begins to happen later in the year. And so, I guess as a parent, how do you access that? Well, talk to the IB coordinator, find out how long they've been in the role, how long have they been at the school, get a sense of their experience with the IB themselves.
Yeah, and by all means, talk to them. But I mean, we certainly do advise, you need to verify what it is that they're saying. It depends on the school. It depends on the school. But, say, for example, we would often do when there's new leadership, we do a little bit of digging. There's an amazing amount of information that you can find quite easily in just a few minutes. We start with LinkedIn, of course. A lot of teachers are not on LinkedIn, which is really annoying, but you can find out. So do some digging. And also you look at the job advertisements as well, because the job description and the requirements will spell out for you what that school, what their requirements are for the person that's supposed to fill the role. So I hope that helps a little, Suresh. I mean, maybe you've got a younger child, that might be a slightly different answer. Let's, if you've got any other questions for Jerome, this is genuinely going to be your last chance. Let's say something briefly about children with, you're welcome, Suresh. He says this is good info. What with children with mild learning differences, and particularly, we've spoken about this before, it seems like every second child these days has a diagnosis of ADHD. So does that present additional challenges going into the diploma? If so, what are the some of the coping mechanisms that you can suggest?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it does present an additional layer of difficulty, because I think what many teenagers and adults with ADHD reflect, and in the psychological literature, the cognitive strain, the mental energy, the tiredness that comes from trying to sort of keep everything in your mind, and then something just is gone. And it's not that you meant for that to go in an ear and one out the other, or you forgot to do that. It's just that was the headspace you were in. Someone was talking at you and you were thinking about something else, and you were aware of not listening to them, but then afterwards you were like, sorry, what? You forgot to ask what it was that had happened.
Sorry, what did you just say? I'm ADHD for sure. Never had a diagnosis, but
well, that's it. And so I think for these kinds of profiles, there's definitely challenges when it comes to staying organized and on top of the fact that all teachers are going to be giving you bits of homework really from week 1, and so there's a lot of independent work that needs to get done, and so there can be a degree of difficulty delivering that, and then, you know, tiredness from it, or it not all get, you know, the mental strain, it doesn't all get done. And then you have a child's grades beginning to slip because from their teacher's perspective, they've just got a kid who's, you know, zoned out, who's not handing in homework. So like, okay, well, that one's a mouth breather. You know, I'll see if I get something at home at Christmas, you know. So that can definitely be a challenge. In terms of, I mean, something that I've always done with students of these profiles that we're working with, you know, I sort of say to kids first, look, you have to acknowledge the problem that you have difficulty organizing things, and that, you know, the fact that you got a poor grade on this particular assignment was not because you couldn't do it, but because you didn't hand it in on time, and then you handed in something that was rushed, that was written the night before. I know that, you know that, so stop pretending it was otherwise. I'm not your teacher. So I think one thing I'm always coaching students to do is to try and advocate for themselves. If they know there's something missed, if they know they're behind on something, just shoot a quick email to the teacher. You know, it's so easy, you know, hi, Mr. Smith, I'm really sorry. I haven't, you know, I know there was some business notes that I was supposed to do on my last class. I haven't done them, but, you know, I'll get that. I will have them done by Friday, and I'll upload them on Manage Back so you can see that I've done them. You know, this is really about the sort of coaching students to sort of, well, really to manage up like you have to do in your first job, so that you can be, if you're not going to meet the deadline, you can keep your teacher or your line manager, in this case, in the loop about when the deadline will be met. And most teachers are pretty forgiving, because, you know, they're not sitting at home thinking up ways to inflict pain on their students. They really do want them to do well. And so the fact that there's dialogue and they know the work's coming is obviously, you know, very, very helpful. Of course, the onus is then on the student to do the follow-up and actually deliver the work, because otherwise, you know, it just becomes, you know, the boy who cried wolf, oh, well, you know, he's always got an excuse and the work doesn't get done. That's not the narrative you want to have bandied around the staffroom about you either. So
so easy to say and then so difficult to do, isn't it?
No, absolutely. And so, I mean, one thing that I often say to parents, and this can be difficult because it involves a degree of assertiveness that obviously teenagers, you know, don't like to have from their parents, but sort of saying, okay, well, you know, if a child has not handed in a bit of work, or if, for example, a parent has been notified, which at IB level, it might, at diploma level, that might not happen until halfway through the term. Perhaps a teacher sends an email saying, I'm a bit worried about Jimmy because he's not submitted any essays at that point. I think framing that from the parent with the student, look, obviously you not handing in work is not an acceptable outcome. And we're not going to scream and shout about the fact that the work wasn't done, but you now need to show me your Google Classroom or your online learning environment, because what you've demonstrated is that you are not able to manage that at this point, and that's fine. But then I need to be, you know, the arbiter here. I need to be the monitor to help make sure that you are doing that, so that there is a plan. And, you know, I've worked with lots of families over the years where parents were stepping in that role. Obviously, they were privileged enough to have the time, you know, to do that. But certainly it was very much a cooperation between us going in perhaps to address very, very specific issues to do with ADHD or dysgraphia in terms of difficulty with writing or organization of, you know, written work. And then also the parents being involved to make sure that work was getting done for the other 167 hours in the week when we weren't working with the kid, because that's how many hours there are in the week, 168. And so, I think most students with difficulty with organization can learn how to organize themselves enough for the IBDP, but without support, I guess the take-home message is it's going to be more difficult for them, near on impossible.
Yeah, as you were talking there, I was thinking that maybe this was additional to what Suresh was asking. It would be a good idea to investigate how many adults are going to be involved in your child's learning, because it can vary from school to school, whether or not there's like a tutor system and what sort of pastoral care or learning support is available, because that can also vary a great deal between schools. And something else that you were mentioning there, just the tech. I mean, I don't know. I mean, you know, you say that the diploma has been around since the 60s. But surely it's become more complex in the last 10 years with all of the tech. You mentioned Manage Back, which is an internal system that quite a lot of schools use to communicate with students, but they don't often do it very well. That's the problem.
Oh, yeah, and I think if I had a bugbear, it's the fact that many schools have stopped issuing or stopped requiring students to have textbooks for the IB diploma. And I mean, hand me a rope to hang myself. I'm sorry. If you're expecting someone to do undergraduate level work and really know scientific concepts, then they've just got to hit the books and understand that level of detail. And so, certainly, well, actually, just last academic year, as I think I might have mentioned to you, Ruth, one of the international schools was having a crisis. And so my team and I stepped in to sort of run their science department for a couple of terms. Yeah. And I was teaching IB high level biology, which is not a subject I have taught it before, but obviously not in recent years. I do other things now. And I realized, on the first day that I went in January, that the kids didn't really have a textbook. And they said, oh, well, we have a digital one, but we've never opened it. I said, in the last year, what? Anyway, so we did a lot of note taking. I guess I was with them. I was doing perhaps some of the sort of academic skill development that I would normally do with a younger student, perhaps a GCSE student, in terms of scaffolding. Okay, well, this is how we're going to flashcard and color code notes so that key principles and definitions, you can all be test each other. It was a small class, 8 of them, and then you can all be word perfect, at least on the most basic level of sort of shared knowledge. And then for our application questions, so we have to think critically, we've got the right language to be able to use to approach, the higher mark questions on the exam. And so, obviously,
that can be a whole second session, Jerome, on good old pen and paper and I walked into a school a few years ago and asked where the library was, and they said, "Oh, well, we don't have one for high school." That was a red flag for me. We are going to wrap it up. This has been super interesting. Thank you so much I think you stayed back in the office for this.
My pleasure.
Thanks a lot. We will upload this. If you are watching on replay and you would like to get in touch with Jerome, would you just type in your contact details into the comments, Jerome?
Yeah, and then absolutely. Do I just, I'm a newbie on this. In the comments. Yes, right. Yes, I've got that there. Oh, wait, so I can see Suresh's question. That's fine.
And then if anyone would like to ask you questions like over the next few days, I'm sure that you would be able to squeeze some time to answer them.
Absolutely. Actually, Ruth, would you mind terribly just putting that in, because I think it's asking me to sign up for something.
I'll do it. Don't worry.
So
okay. So thank you, Jerome. Next week, we are also on a different time. Sorry about this, but I can't say no to guests. And, you guys are busy and you're juggling your calendars. So we're going kind of backwards, but we're going to have a conversation with Joshua Blue about the PYP. And that's already up there. So please juice. I think that's at 4 o'clock, because I'm actually going up to the Japanese school to sit with him after I've looked around the school. If I've frozen again. Thank you. We will end the broadcast. Thanks, Jerome. Thanks, everyone, for watching. And we will see you next week. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.